Accountants have come a long way since they inventoried the pharaoh's grain, gold, and other assets in ancient Egypt. And although the specialty of fraud examination dates back hundreds of years, the modern fraud examiner is a relatively new species. As a result, the distinction between a fraud examiner and a traditional accountant bears emphasis. Most typical accountants and financial executives are involved in reviewing a company's ongoing internal control procedures, as well as in preparing or auditing the business's financial statements. The modern fraud examiner studies and analyzes those items and more. In many instances, he or she also surveys and investigates complex financial, economic, and operational issues that affect a company. In addition, studying competitors and the relevant marketplace may also be required. We asked Rebecca Saran to get the lowdown on whether the current economic recovery means that we're going to be in a boom time for fraud.
That's a great question, Mike. Here with the answer is Steve Meringue, president of the San Francisco chapter of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, as well as a senior manager at Frank Rimmerin and Company. Thanks for joining us this month, Steve.
It's my pleasure to be here, Becky.
I'm going to start with an on the one hand question for you this month, Steve. On the one hand, people in general, and our viewers especially, are always interested in fraud. But on the other hand, it's been 20 years since Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Do we really have to pay that much attention to fraud today?
That's an excellent question. And Becky, I think today, although it has been 20 years, there's still a great need for us to focus on fraud and internal controls. Even though Enron has been there and we've all heard about the scandals that have happened, we still see that there's actually no significant decrease in fraud as we see it today. In fact, the recent examples of Madoff and Olympus in Japan have shown that fraud is continuing to be there, and we have to combat it.
It wasn't that long ago that most of our viewers' companies recovered from a prolonged economic recession. So let me ask you, to what extent has there already been, or is there likely to be, another uptick in the incidence of reported fraud as there was 20 years ago?
I think that fraud is very non-cyclical. Although we're coming out of a recession, the economy is maybe getting better, and we really don't see a decrease or increase of fraud depending on the economy. There are reasons and pressures for people to commit fraud when times aren't good. They feel the pressure to meet the numbers, they want to build reserves, but also when times get better, they have an increased opportunity to commit fraud.
Thanks, Steve. We'll return to your commentary in a minute.
As businesses increasingly rely on digital technologies and networks to conduct their operations, financial executives are increasingly aware that there is an increased risk to their organization associated with cybersecurity, resulting from more frequent and more severe cyber incidents. As a result, the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance addressed this trend a few years ago by issuing guidance regarding the disclosure obligations of public companies relating to cybersecurity risks and cyber incidents. In fact, so far this year, more than 1,500 companies traded on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ stock market listed some form of the words cybersecurity, hacking, hackers, cyber attacks, or data breach as a business risk in this year's securities filings.
I'm curious, Steve, to what extent does technology in general, and cybercrime in particular, account for the recent and continued rise in fraud?
Well, I personally think that, unfortunately, due to the fact how technology has just been increasing in all aspects of our life and in the way we do business, the amount of cybercrime that is going to rise with that increase in technology will unfortunately bring with it increased fraud. Experts today say that cybercrime, identity theft, and all the frauds that result in that are probably one of the biggest challenges we have going forward.
Well, that makes sense, Steve. But let me ask you, is it that employees are more motivated to commit fraud because they haven't gotten pay raises and are living beyond their means? Or is it due to the fact that corporate cutbacks have resulted in fewer sets of eyes to monitor workplace behavior?
That's a great question, Becky, and I think it's actually a combination of both. There are indeed increased pressures for people to commit fraud, and by companies reducing their internal controls, we're seeing an uptick in the typical types of embezzlement, which rely upon internal controls to prevent.
Whenever we've talked about fraud on this program, I've heard experts mention the so-called fraud triangle: opportunity, motive, and rationalization. How relevant is that, or is that still relevant in today's business environment?
I think the fraud triangle is as relevant as it has ever been. Every fraud case that I've ever investigated, I've been able to use the fraud triangle to determine the pressures that were being faced, the motivations, the rationalizations of the persons who were committing the fraud, as well as the opportunities that were there. The fraud triangle is the one tool that we use where we can really hone in on how and why frauds are committed. So I think it's just as relevant today as it's ever been.
In the 2 decades since Congress enacted the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, most of our viewers' companies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to install internal controls and comply with the statute. I'm curious, Steve, to what extent has that investment had an impact in lessening the incidence of fraud in the past few years?
This is another great question, Becky. You know, there's been a lot of talk about whether or not Sarbanes-Oxley is effective because people feel the pain of the initial implementation of it cost a lot of money, a lot of resources were done. What we haven't seen is a significant decrease in the amount of frauds being committed. And the reason for that is fraud is not only based on compliance, it's also based on the ethical culture of the organization. Sarbanes-Oxley is, or the impact of Sarbanes-Oxley has been that fraud at the lower level has probably been more impacted than fraud at the upper level, just because top management still has the ability to circumvent internal controls.
As our viewers certainly realize, white-collar crime is, in many respects, an enigma. The experts in criminal justice, as well as in human behavior, continue to debate what it is and how it differs from so-called street crime, who commits it, the frequency and cost of such crimes, as well as the motives for white-collar crime, all remain controversial. On the other hand, the nature and threat of occupational fraud is truly universal. In that context, many of the findings of the 2014 Report to the Nations on Occupational Fraud and Abuse reflect and confirm long-standing trends that we've discussed in the past. Once again, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners estimates that businesses typically lose 5% of their revenue to occupational fraud each year. In a similar vein, the ACFE found that more than 86% of the perpetrators of these frauds had no previous charges or criminal convictions.
Well, since you're a certified fraud examiner, Steve, let me ask you about the latest report from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They found once again that fraud committed from the top of the organization is the most damaging. Does that finding surprise you?
Not at all. Actually, this is consistent with what we've seen in the past. Fraud committed at the top of the organization usually is involving financial statement fraud, which on a per incident level is much higher than the individual fraud committed at the lower level, which are more typically the embezzlement frauds.
Another finding that I noticed from the ACFE report, Steve, tips are still the #1 method of fraud detection. But from where do these tips come, and how do you get your employees and vendors to report what they observe?
It's always been a great information that tips are the #1 way in which fraud is detected. It should be no surprise. Fraud, as we know, is committed by people, not by processes, not by systems, but by people. And it's that personal impact that others see and they rely on to give that as a tip. Now, we see companies that have implemented whistleblower or hotlines as having a much higher rate of tips of detection, as well as having much shorter terms of the fraud being committed and the average loss. So we recommend that all companies, one of the best ways to fight fraud or to raise their level of detection is to implement a whistleblower hotline. In fact, companies that have implemented anonymous whistleblower hotlines have a much higher rate of fraud detection than those who haven't. Also, the average rate of time before which a fraud is uncovered, as well as the level of loss, is greatly decreased for those companies who have implemented such a hotline.
Well, you know the way that management thinks, Steve, as well as the way that auditors operate. From your experience, are most organizations conducting investigations whenever there's a theft, or do they generally conduct fraud vulnerability assessments on an ongoing basis?
You know, that's another great question. I don't think that most organizations are conducting investigations each and every time they have a fraud. I think it is based on the level of fraud and also on the organization, their location, the type of industry they're in, and their internal resources. What I do see is that there is an increased level of firms conducting fraud risk assessments. 10 years ago, I almost found no organizations doing this. Today, almost every organization that I go to does, in some form or another, a fraud risk assessment each year.
Having a formal fraud risk management process sounds great. After all, no organization wants to find out about fraud that took place from an SEC investigation or from the front page of the Wall Street Journal, do they?
Exactly. This is what most companies fear the most, being blindsided. And I always give a great example. Is most people are familiar with the woes that Walmart has faced in Mexico. They were exposed through the press about their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act bribery and the allegations that they were having from the DOJ. And what I see is this is a perfect example of how at the board level they weren't linking their strategic objectives with their fraud risk assessment. They weren't taking the time to think about how the decision that they made about going to Mexico was actually changing the risk profile of their organization. If they would have considered that, they might have taken other steps. They could have changed timelines, they could have changed budgets, goals. They might have even chosen a different team which would have another approach to compliance than the one they actually implemented.
Up until now, we've been talking about Sarbanes-Oxley, about ACFE, and events taking place in the United States. But as you know, our viewers are in organizations with a global presence, with operations, employees, customers, and vendors that cross borders. To what extent is there a global interest in anti-fraud controls?
I think across the globe, anti-fraud controls is #1 priority. Given today the organization's reach are global, as you mentioned, well, so are the anti-fraud organizations. I know 10 years ago, people were traveling to the U.S. to attend anti-fraud conferences. Now there's almost an anti-fraud conference on every continent every year, and these are being well attended. Organizations also realize that fraud is not limited to their home country or to their organization, but crosses borders. So we see an increased amount of cooperation between both private sector as well as the public sector.
Well, that certainly makes sense, Steve. Can you give us an example?
Well, if we look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that was a U.S.-based anti-bribery law that has been in effect since the 1970s. The U.S. was one of the few countries who actually had implemented a law. Well, now we see that companies across the globe, in Europe, including the UK and Germany, in Asia, they're all implementing anti-corruption, anti-bribery laws. And this has shown that there is an increased awareness of the issues that come out of bribing officials, and that it cannot be combated by one country with the other ones not doing anything at all. So although it's taken a very long time for this to happen, we see now that specifically over the last 2 to 3 years, many of these laws have been implemented and they're starting to take effect.
Well, I've certainly heard over the years a lot about tone at the top. What does that mean in the context of anti-fraud initiatives?
Setting the tone at the top is really one of the most important aspects of having a successful anti-fraud culture. And we've heard a lot about, management override and about how pressures from the top down were the reasons that earlier frauds were committed. And now we're seeing that not only at the C-suite level, but also at the board level, there's an increased push, I would say, for them to set a better tone at the top, to increase the level of education both within the organization and to communicate that down about what does that mean, what is acceptable, what is our risk appetite, what is our risk tolerance, and what is our tolerance towards fraud. Luckily, some organizations have successfully implemented a zero-tolerance approach to fraud. No fraud is accepted, no matter for what reason, what level, or for what amount. And I think those organizations going forward and the managers and leaders that they send out then who will go into other organizations are probably one of the best ways that we're going to see fraud being combated in the future.
Well, since I began this section with an on the one hand question, Steve, let me also conclude with one of them as well. On one hand, professional skepticism is a key cornerstone of the auditing profession. On the other hand, the fact is, many auditors are well versed in spreadsheets, but they may not be terribly experienced or terribly good at investigations, are they?
Well, that's another great point. It is the fact that auditors are not naturally born investigators. Although they do work with numbers and spreadsheets, what they tend not to work with as much are people and crime. And fraud are criminals, and people who commit fraud need to be held accountable. So that's why I say to most organizations that you really help yourself if you hire somebody else inside to your organization, if you don't have the expertise to conduct a fraud investigation, because in all those cases where I've gone to, where companies have started off on their own, they've made mistakes which have cost them.
Could a labor dispute on U.S. or Canadian shores be considered a political risk for your company? Or what about the threat of increased piracy off the coast of Somalia? Can such disruptions be prevented? Or put another way, can companies at least mitigate the losses associated with supply chain breakdowns? These questions have become much more important to businesses as they have faced relentless customer demand for better value at less cost, for individual customization and greater choice, for faster delivery and higher quality, and now for increased environmental awareness.
Let me also ask you about risk, Steve, since the more things change, the more they stay the same. Last year, we discussed the impact of Super Typhoon Haiyan on the corporate supply chain. This week, we could substitute monster hurricane or twin tornadoes and continue that discussion, couldn't we? I mean, there's always going to be some risk out there, won't there?
Yes, of course. Risk is just a part of life and of business. And if we accept the notions of impermanence and change, we're going to also have to accept risk. What I tell to a lot of the executives I lead in workshops is I say there's a tendency usually for people to be afraid of risk and usually to downplay the risk within their organization. But the fact is that the reason that organizations are successful is because they take on risk. And the risk that they take on is weighed against a benefit. So to say that risk is bad, I don't agree. Risk is just a fact of life. And if we're looking at an organization, they can look at the different types of risks that they face, be it financial, competitive, internal, external, regulatory compliance, and deal with those risks as they come.
As financial executives, our viewers certainly understand their organization's business model and its balance sheet. But how can they make certain that they fully understand its risk exposures?
Well, to start off with, I think it's important to note that management does a great job dealing with risk every day. It's not to say that they're not looking at risk. Every day-to-day, through their day-to-day operations, they're dealing with risk, they're managing it. But what I think they need to do is once in a while take a step back and look at their organization holistically and look at the type of risks that are affecting the organization. To this end, I recommend that management conduct an annual risk assessment workshop. I've seen that having a workshop where management can come together to talk openly about risks, to use voting technology to vote on those risks, is one of the key aspects of them to make sure that they've successfully addressed the risks that are facing the organization.
That makes sense, Steve. But let me ask you, from your perspective, is risk management a compliance exercise or is it a strategic imperative?
I think risk management has to be strategic. I think it cannot be just compliance. I think the value in doing a risk management or having a risk management program and conducting a risk management assessment is in aligning that to your strategy and getting the most benefit out of it as possible.
The famous quote from Santayana says, "Those who do not remember their past are condemned to repeat their mistakes." So let me ask you, what can companies do differently in terms of their risk management?
I think formally embracing a risk management process is the first step that they need to take. Organizations need to understand that although they deal with risk every day, they might not be necessarily risk experts. And what they have to understand is that their risk environment, the environment in which they live and work, is changing. And it's constantly moving. So successful companies that I've seen who have used risk management to help their business have conducted risk assessments, have understood that those risk assessments, the process doesn't stop there, but they continue further down the road, treating risks, monitoring risks, and reporting on those risks as an ongoing process. And it's really been embraced by both management and the board. Those companies who can do that, I think, have a strategic advantage over their competitors who don't.
An important development in the internal control landscape was recently completed with an update to the so-called integrated framework of the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. Viewers will recall that since 1992, COSO's original internal control framework was accepted by the SEC as a framework for attesting to internal control over financial reporting and has been recognized as the leading guidance for designing, implementing, and conducting internal control and assessing its effectiveness. In fact, the SEC's chief accountant has already reiterated that companies would be wise to pay attention to what COSO says about its old framework. that the original 1992 framework will, in fact, become obsolete in a few months at the end of 2014. The good news is that the same 5 main components of the original framework — control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring activities — remain the foundation for the updated framework.
Well, we can't discuss risk without mentioning COSO. And this year, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission replaced the original 1992 internal control framework with an updated version. But please remind me, Steve, if that original framework was so successful and stood the test of time, why was it updated? Was there an outcry for revision?
Yeah, that's another great question, Becky. You know, the update to the COSO framework, as you mentioned, was 20 years after the original framework. And I talked to actually a couple of the authors. I had the privilege while it was going through discussion. And I asked them exactly that question, is why are we updating the framework? And it was basically saying that the framework, although it was a good framework and it has been used successfully, just was not, it needed an update, it needed a facelift. And you know, if we talk about the technology that was being used back in when the framework was originally done and where we are today, we can see that no framework, regardless of how well it was written, could just be unchanged at this time. So I think the main reason, the main driver behind the framework update was the increase in technology.
So many changes in so little time. So let me go back to basics. They're not going to change the COSO cube, are they?
That's correct. The COSO cube has remained more or less unchanged. There has been a couple small wording changes, but the shape and form of the cube as we know it in the past has remained the same.
I suppose that giving the original COSO guidance an update or a makeover might be a good idea. It was difficult enough to remember the 3 core objectives and the 5 framework components. Are we really going to have to learn 17 new principles, Steve?
I'm afraid so. 17 new principles, that's correct. But I want to go back and say that those principles that we've had before, that we have now, they've always been there. They've just been embedded in the framework as it previously was. Now what COSO has done is they've pulled those 17 principles out and called them out specifically. And now those are the 17 principles which were brought out to help us better understand and implement the COSO framework.
Well, it's not just new principles, is it, Steve? Isn't there also something called points of focus, and are there really 75 of them?
Yes, that is correct. There are 77 points of focus which are aligned to the 17 principles. And these points of focus were created, again, to help with the implementation of the COSO framework. Now, one of the underlying changes is that as both management and auditors, we have to use the points of focus to ensure that controls are both present and functioning. So we're seeing a lot of effort now around both understanding the points of focus and doing mapping exercises from the points of focus back up through to the controls and the principles.
On one hand, the framework is more granular, but on the other hand, there's still an opportunity for subjective judgment, isn't there?
Like any good framework, it has to be flexible. And we've seen that with the original COSO framework, it was very flexible and it stood the test of time. The authors of the new framework have tried to do the same, and I think successfully, in that they've allowed helped with a lot of the interpretation, but are allowing a lot of subjectivity in when actually implementing the framework into the organization. We're going through now helping organizations in the first steps of implementing the new COSO framework, and we see that each organization can handle it correctly in different ways.
Okay, it's getting very close to the transition date of December 15, 2014, when the new COSO framework officially supersedes the original 1992 framework. What's the official guidance on making the transition?
Well, the official guidance is that the SEC has confirmed that they are expecting companies filing after December 15th of this year to be using the new updated framework. Now, again, this is not mandatory, but they have issued very strong guidance that they would expect every company to be using the new framework, and if not, they would have to have a good explanation as to why they're not using the framework. Apart from that, it just makes sense. The new framework has been superseded. It is out there. There's been plenty of discussion around it, and every company that we see has understood that they need to implement it. So for those companies, if there's a company out there that would choose not to implement the new COSO framework, after December 15th, I think they would have a lot of pushback both from their auditors as well as external stakeholders.
Oh, that makes sense, Steve. But what are you advising your clients that they should do, or at least consider during the transition to the new framework?
Well, as a first step, we're advising our clients to educate themselves and their boards about the changes to the framework. This is very important in order for boards as well as for management to understand the impact that this changes in framework could have on them. And then we're asking or we're advising our clients to actually take it to the next step and look at how those changes in the framework are specifically affecting them. Now, the framework, it's important to say, is not, obviously we've talked about Sarbanes-Oxley, it's not only affecting their Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, but also their other compliance programs, such as internal audit. Now, this will be important for companies to understand at this stage what exactly is the impact to the organization and to educate themselves further along the path of compliance with the new framework.
That also makes sense, but how do you begin? Is there a first step that companies should take?
Well, we recommend to our clients as a first step to have these meetings with their top management and with their boards to inform them about the changes. And as the next step, we've actually conducted risk assessments and mapping exercises with our clients to help them in the process of transitioning from the old framework to the new framework. Now, this mapping exercise, although at first was very tedious, we found it to be very helpful in helping companies understand the changes and the impact to them.
As accountants and financial executives, our viewers are very bottom line oriented. I suppose they want to know, has there been a return for their substantial investment in developing a system of internal control?
I think like any implementation, those companies have done it well, have definitely benefited. And I think those companies who understood that internal controls and having strong internal controls can benefit their processes both in efficiency and effectiveness are the ones who have leveraged it and have gained most out of it. Those companies who see it as purely as a compliance exercise are the ones who have seen the least benefit from it.
As I expected, Steve, you've covered a lot of ground for us this month. If our viewers could take one thought away from this discussion, what would you like that to be?
Becky, you know, clients ask me that a lot, and what I tell them is I want them to understand how important it is to link their internal controls to their risk management process and to their fraud prevention. By linking those three areas together, I've seen clients who have greatly benefited to their organization and to their bottom line. So if you're going to seriously tackle these areas, I tell my clients, consider it all, do it well, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Frank Ribbons, Steve Meringue, thanks for answering my tough questions.
Becky, it was my pleasure to be here today.
That interview with Steve Meringue concludes the September 2014 edition of the Financial Management Network. On behalf of everyone at FMN, thank you for joining us this month, and we look forward to bringing you up to date again with our October 2014 release.